fellas, look, a pickup rally. Hey, we were going hunting. Hey, buddy, mind if we enter?
Why not? Do it.
Whoa, watch the head. No sweat. My Jeep pickup's got great ground clearance.
You can't go up there.
Sure I can. This Jeep pickup's equipped with quadra-track. Jeep's automatic four-wheel drive. No other pickup's got that.
Did we make it?
Make it? Pretty good, huh, guys? Just what we need on a hunting trip.
Come to Jeep Country in a Jeep pickup. We wrote the book on four-wheel drive.
If you've been in off-roading long, you know that the corporate 14 bolt is an absolute staple. This is a very inexpensive axle that is everywhere. It's in every junkyard in America. It's got 30 spline shafts, but are basically sized to a 35 spline because they're cut a little bit different. And if you get the full float 10.5-inch ring gear version like we have here, you have a very strong axle right out of the gate with a lot of aftermarket options and videos and information on how to build them.
Most of the stuff that I build around here is like a mid-size truck. It's a Toyota Tacoma size truck. It's a Land Rover Discovery size truck. It's a Jeep Wrangler size truck. These are all vehicles where you're going to a 1-ton axle just to be able to sustain the extra rotational mass of a tire to keep your axle shafts from breaking, going full float. And I'm very partial to the Ford 9-inch because I think the Ford 9-inch punches way above its weight class in terms of strength of that ring and pinion because of the dual bearing support on your pinion. But when you're working with something that's gonna be as heavy as this is gonna be loaded down with recovery gear. It's already got the weight of a Cummins. It's gonna have 1-ton axles. I could see a world, we're gonna weigh this thing, but if I've got a generator in here, I've got a full welder, gas bottle, we load this thing down with tools, I bet we could hit the trail at like anywhere between 9,000 and 10,000 pounds. We need a 1-ton axle, not just to sustain the extra force of having like bigger tires, but we also need 1-ton axles to be able to sustain the amount of weight and load in the bed and the crazy amount of torque out of this engine. So I love the Ford 9-inch. We could build a crazy hybrid Ford 9-inch, but the fact that this makes 420 foot-pounds of torque at only 1,600 RPM stock, I think that is a great case to have to upgrade our ring and pinion size out of the size of the Ford 9-inch and go to something bigger to make sure that we're not stripping ring gears when we're on the trail.
This Dana 80 rear axle is super strong that came in this 1-ton Dodge chassis that we're using. But there's a few issues with these. It's got an 11.25-inch ring gear, an 11.25, which is giant. You have the ability to upgrade these to a 40 spline axle shaft, which is amazing. But if we want it to go any narrower, there's no narrow options from the factory. We're chopping and narrowing this and then getting custom axle shafts made, which is expensive. And even if we just left this in stock form and just put our own brackets on it, even just building like the normal internal parts is more expensive than building a corporate 14 bolt. So I decided to get away from the Dana 80, use a corporate 14, but I considered all my options and even looked at Dana 70, Sterling 10.5, and whenever you do all the research and you've built using these axles in the past, just like I have, you often end up getting redirected to the corporate 14 bolt for a number of reasons.
In the world of 1-ton axles, the 14 bolt is amazing, but the axle shaft strength, in my opinion, is actually its biggest weakness. These are all full float axle shafts that I happen to have laying around, and this honestly is like a pretty good representation of what options you're gonna have in the junkyard. So I've got them from smallest to biggest. The Dana 110 this is in here for fun. This is not a 1-ton axle shaft. This is like a 3-ton axle shaft. Anyway, we're gonna start with the Sterling 10.5. You're gonna find this in Ford F-250s and F-350s, and they used them for a very long time. This is the smallest shaft out of the bunch, and I measure the smallest point that I can find on the shaft because that is, in my experience, where it always breaks. So we're at 1.34 inches for the Sterling 10.5. This is the 14 bolt, and this is the second smallest, and this is what we're gonna be using in our J10 pickup truck. And it's at 1.35 at its smallest point. And the smallest point for this shaft ended up being right here behind the splines. And I did notice that the middle dimension of this, the 14 bolt, is a slightly bigger measurement than the middle dimension of the Sterling. But because this is where it's the smallest, this is typically where you're gonna see it break. The Dana 70 out of my 3/4 ton Dodge and the Dana 80 out of my 1-ton Dodge ended up being the exact same size diameter shaft.
and the thinnest point that I could find was right here behind the flange. Now, I have heard that the Dana 70 and the Dana 80 are the exact same outers. They're the exact same shafts. You know, these are a different length, but as far as like strength, they're the same. And this basically confirms it. I mean, they're extremely similar. The big difference between these two axles is definitely going to be ring and pinion size. At 1.57 inches in its smallest dimension, this Dana 110 shaft is no joke. And you can see over here on the side, it's a bigger flange, which, I mean, isn't really an indication of strength, but it's just an indication of how beefy this thing is. And when you look at the side here on the end, you can really see how much bigger this Dana 110 axle shaft is. So what's interesting is everything else Dana that I have messed with, their splines are the same size no matter what Dana axle you're working on. But there's definitely an exception here for the Dana 110, because this is a 35 spline axle. This Dana 80 is a 35 spline, the Dana 70 is a 35 spline, and the Ford Sterling is a 35 spline. The Sterling I would expect to be different than the rest of these, but I am surprised that this bigger Dana doesn't carry the same size splines. They measure this spline distance a lot differently. And the 14 bolt's a 30 spline, but it doesn't make a difference as far as like its size. It's the same size. They just, in GM and Ford are measuring their splines differently than Dana. Now, I think it's really important to bring up that the axle shaft diameter is not the end all be all predictor as to which one of these axle shafts would break first. But the tensile strength on most modern axles is extremely similar. So there is absolutely a correlation with axle shaft size and the amount of hurting you can put on this truck. So I'm sure that many of you are wondering, why would I use the corporate 14 bolt whenever it does have like a smaller axle shaft than the other full float axles in its class? And it's because the 14 bolt has a bunch of different qualities that you don't find in these other axles. One would be the extra bearing on the pinion. So your strength of your ring and pinion is directly correlated with the tooth-to-tooth contact. The larger the ring and pinion, the more tooth-to-tooth contact you have, which is really nice when you're wheeling with a big powerful Cummins that makes crazy low end torque. But even though the Dana 80 has an 11.25 inch ring gear and the 14 bolt has a 10.5 inch ring gear, the corporate 14 bolt has a special nose bearing on the end of the pinion which resists deflection, and deflection is what's going to actually strip your ring and pinion. So there's a reason that this 14 bolt punches really far above its weight class in terms of its ring and pinion strength. On top of that, I'm able to get a 63 inch wheel mount surface to wheel mount surface axle out of a cabin chassis, which is something I haven't found in any of these other axle types. So that's also another huge benefit. Other features of the 14 bolt is it's probably the cheapest one to modify out of all these axles in terms of like locker costs, ring and pinion costs, plus the pinion is shorter in this than other axles, and the pinion drops into the front just like the Ford 9-inch, allowing us to run a pinion guard, which is a little controversial. Some people hate them. Personally, I'm a gigantic fan of a pinion guard, so that is something we're definitely going to utilize in this build. The next thing that needs to be considered whenever you are looking at all the different full float rear end options is definitely brakes. These big old school drum brakes, I mean, they work, but for an off-road rig, I am like militantly against drum brakes. I've had so many issues with drum brakes off-road because of going through mud or going through water, whatever the situation may be, and it's just so much easier to fix a stuck caliper than it is to fix any sort of an issue with a big complicated drum brake setup. The rear drum brakes that were on this axle are gigantic, and I'm sure they stop just fine. But drum brakes, they fade a lot faster. They're a huge issue off-road. In my experience, they are a giant pain. And yes, you can have a caliper seize up on you, but usually you don't have to even take the wheel off. You can just tap it a few times with a hammer and whatnot, and you can get it to release. Whereas with drums, I mean, you're pulling everything apart, especially with a dually. We have to pull the whole hub and everything off just to be able to expose the inside of a drum. It turns into a giant nightmare if just one little spring falls out while you're on the trail and now that drum doesn't work correctly, or maybe it locks up or whatever.
So a disc brake conversion for these rear axles, in my opinion, is an absolute must. The more modern full float axle you get, like a lot of the Sterlings come with disc, a lot of the more modern 14 bolts come with disc, so you'll have that built in. But for us, we didn't have that option. I got a good deal on a cab chassis rear axle, and we're just rolling with it. My idea for a cheap disc brake conversion is by using the front brakes that were originally on this Dodge chassis. It was a 1999 Dodge Ram 3500 dually front brakes. And because it's the same bolt pattern, I was hoping that it would fit behind this Chevy rear hub. And sure enough, I mean, everything slides in there and indexes perfectly. And I want to use this setup because it's already from a dually, and I know that it's going to clear these dually wheels because it was clearing these dually wheels whenever we had the old front axle on here. So right now, I'm trying to figure out the perfect spot for these single piston rear calipers. And then we're going to probably use some 3/8 plate, some stuff that I have laying around, to build some kind of a bracket that's super beefy and hopefully not too complicated.
This video is all about the J10 pickup truck, Dirt Reynolds, we're calling it. But for those of you that have been watching the channel and you know that I've made a giant life change in the last 6 months and I've been building out this shop and building out this property, behind the scenes, we have been doing a ton, literally tons of work. We're moving tons of gravel, and I've built roads all around the shop. I've got a road down to my barn. I've got a road up to my house. We have been doing a crap load of work behind the scenes while I'm trying to film this J10 video. By the end of this video, it won't feel like we made it very far, but if we are going to get to a point where I can order a whole bunch of stuff, and we are getting this property to a point where hopefully starting next week, I can focus solely on this J10, and we can start doing weekly videos on this thing that are going to be like giant leaps forward instead of just a few steps here and there. For months, you've been hearing me talk about a grinding room. And I mean, when I read the comments, you guys are as excited as I am. This is really neat, and it's not something I ever thought that I would have in a shop. Now, we finally got the vent fan in here, and I've got to say, this is working so good. And there is a clear difference between all of the dust and metal crap on the floor in the room versus outside of the room. But unfortunately, it didn't solve all of my problems. Even with it being able to move air through this space, I just got so dang hot today. I'm pushing myself way too hard out here. I started to have chest pains. It's like 94 or 92 or something out. Super muggy. And so I went in and chilled for a bit, and I don't feel good. I gotta keep working, but I can't cover myself head to toe in PPE and expect not to overheat. Plus, I'm 39 now. I need to make sure that I'm on top of that stuff. People my age do have heart attacks all the time because of heat. So, this is where it's gonna be for now. I think that in order to keep me cool, we're gonna put together a suspension system. The combination of packaging constraints and axle wrap issues that I see down the road and just a number of other reasons, we're going to get rid of the leaf springs and we're going to use coils and like a 4-link in the rear. This is an off-road truck. It needs to ride nice. It needs to be somewhat tunable. I want to make sure that this thing is not a nightmare going down dirt roads to then get to the trails or anything in between. Plus, again, whenever we throw 37s on this thing and we've got all that low-end torque from this diesel, I could see some huge axle wrap issues developing in a truck like this if we kept it leaf spring. So we're going to get ahead of all that. We're going to do it the right way, right out of the box, hopefully. And I'm going to use a whole bunch of these parts from Barnes 4-Wheel Drive to build a one-of-a-kind and budget-friendly rear 4-link. The plan is coming together. I'm going to do a parallel 4-link in the rear with a panhard bar. It's super simple setup. Well, in my opinion, super simple setup. We'll go over all that in the next video. But I figure what I would do, and I thought about this while I was cutting the frame, is once we once we put our fish plate on here, we finish welding it, we can throw our bracket right on the bottom to shore it up just a little bit more, which it'll be shored up plenty with the way we're gonna do it, but it doesn't hurt to have a link mount right on the bottom side of that to make sure that we got a little bit more strength. The bed's gonna go forward probably 2 inches or so. I want this to have a normal gap like you would on any other truck. And then we're gonna move the wheelbase to match that wheel well. And I'm gonna be chopping and modifying these flares. These are like pretty thick steel actually, but they need to be massaged out and then stretched out to be dually. So we have some huge issues, but I've got some ideas that I think are gonna work really well for this. These front springs match this front axle. This is from a 2008 Ford Super Duty, and I didn't want to clear this axle off. I wanted to try to figure out a way to use most of the brackets, if not all the brackets that are on here. And the guy that I bought the front axle from had the springs that came with that truck. So boom, we've got springs for the front, Super Duty F350 springs, which should be a really similar front end weight to what you would see in a Cummins. We'll see. These are the old front springs, and I figure these should be pretty good for rear springs because of all the bed weight we're gonna be adding to this thing. We'll see. The good news is there's always aftermarket options. If this sags too much or it's too stiff or whatever, I can find another spring that works, but this is gonna be a really good, cheap way to get our foot in the door. I'm hoping to throw the spring between the frame and the top of the axle housing. I mean, as you can see, there's no chance we're gonna be able to use these leaf springs because the dually axle that we're putting in there is narrower by a lot than the dually axle that's on here now. So the tire would absolutely be hitting the spring. Plus, because of the way we're gonna wheel this and because of all the torque and everything else, I don't wanna have to deal with all the axle wrap that's gonna happen here. And I would like to just do a 4-link and get ahead of all those problems. I've been thinking about this axle plan and the suspension plan for so long. It is very satisfying to see it all coming together. Next week's gonna be a huge week. These are the caliper brackets that you saw me working on. I wanna wait to install those until we have brand new calipers, brand new rotors on hand, which will be next week. So I think it's smarter to tack these in place with brand new brakes to make sure that everything's actually gonna be centered where it needs to be, and there's not like a half worn out pad that's gonna make it to where I tack things just slightly off, and then when I go to put brand new brakes on it in the future, we're boned. So I think this is gonna be the smartest way forward. Next week, I'm gonna build a homemade axle truss. We're gonna build a homemade mini shave kit and a homemade rear diff cover for this thing. We're gonna build a homemade rear pinion guard. We're gonna do everything we can to save money because right now I'm gonna be over budget on this truck. So I'm trying to find ways that we can like shave cost to make it to where we can be under that $20,000 umbrella that is going on in this competition. Hopefully wheel or tires show up next week, which would be sweet. We can start working on DIY bead locks. There's an insane amount of work. I'm hoping by the end of the next video, we're gonna be able to cycle the rear suspension with some dually tires on it because I just think it's gonna look super neat. But that means we've got to get the rear axle done minus gear and locker install, just all the fab done. And it means that we've got to get like the frame done and prepped enough that we can weld brackets on it. So it's gonna be a huge video. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for bearing with me over the last few months as I've been trying to do these while improving our property and getting the shop done. We're at a point now where all we have to do is build a rail for that loft, and it's all hands on deck for this J10. We'll see you on the next one.